Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. It's Bram Duffee. We're here to talk about human communication, and we're in Unit 6. And during our Unit 6, we get to talk about conversational interaction. And you think conversational interaction is something you do every day. And today I'm here to say that, well, I'm just excited to say that we're going to get into it on a deeper level. So there's a lot to talk about. And I want to start out with a shared screen so that we can work through some stuff together. So let me move some technical things around for us. I don't know if you can tell, but we're going to be talking about noise. Managing noise in your message, types of noise. And yeah, even even some doublespeak. So, have you ever tried having a conversation in a noisy cafe? You know, someplace that's like where you struggle to focus on the person that's in front of you. And gosh, that's noise in action. It's anything that disrupts the communication. But you know, the noise isn't always just literal sound, it's something that comes in different forms. And each form can seriously derail our ability to connect. So let's break it down so you can spot and manage some of these disruptions. So, one here, there's semantic noise. And semantic noise happens when words or phrases are misunderstood. So, for example, if you imagine someone saying, we need to table this discussion, are they asking to delay the topic or to prioritize it? Well, cultural differences or industry specific kinds of jargon often create this kind of confusion. So, to manage semantic noise, clarity is really key. So, we don't assume that our audience understands everything. We rephrase, we ask for feedback, or even provide examples that can clear up potential misunderstandings. The next one that's mentioned here, you can see, is emotional noise. Emotional noise can really wreak havoc on communication. So picture this, you're having a disagreement with a friend, and instead of hearing the words, you just focus on how upset you feel. And strong emotions like frustration or anger, and sometimes even excitement, are something that can cloud our ability to interpret messages accurately. So, to minimize emotional noise, we want to take a moment and calm ourselves before addressing a sensitive issue so that we can focus on the listener instead of just reacting. And that helps create a more respectful dialogue, going a long way to reduce tension. And then there's this environmental noise. This is the kind of disruption that you just might imagine. So it's like a dog barking during a Zoom call, or a loud air conditioner that's buzzing, or even something intentionally distracting that's in the background. So these physical surroundings can make it hard to concentrate. And imagining if we were to manage environmental noise, it's about control. So we want to choose quieter spaces, wear noise canceling headphones, or maybe just address the distraction directly, like asking a roommate to turn down the TV. But being proactive is something that's going to reduce its effect. Now, deliberate noise introduces more nuanced kinds of challenges. You know, this is when um, people intentionally disrupt communication. And they do this to sometimes manipulate or confuse. And a prime example of this is doublespeak. You see this as the last point on your screen. This reflects dishonesty and erodes trust. And so it's like when people intentionally disrupt the communication to manipulate, and doublespeak is like if you were to call layoffs, instead of the word layoffs, you were to use something like employee rebalancing. It's something that makes the negative actually sound positive, which can mislead or distort reality. And doublespeak reflects dishonesty. And so this is something that I think about when I look at the ballot box. Sometimes things that you vote on are difficult to understand because of the way they're presented. So we have to ask questions and we have to seek clarity and don't shy away from addressing language that's vague, especially head on. Um, you know, Managing noise in communication starts with awareness. And so, whether it's unintended kinds of misunderstandings or maybe a deliberate kind of interference, is recognizing the type of noise at play really works to equip you to handle it effectively. And when you learn to clear these barriers, your messages aren't just going to be heard, they'll be understood. I want to make sure to pop these up. Euphemisms, jargon, Berkowski, and inflated language. Cool. So impressive. Here we go. Language is a tool, but it could also be used as a weapon. So doublespeak takes ordinary communication, like I said, and it twists it. That often makes the unpleasant sound um, good, or the boring sound like it's something that's impressive. So today we're going to unpack some of the categories of doublespeak with this. So the first one on the list is euphemisms. Euphemisms are soft, gentle words or phrases that are used to replace something that might be harsh or unpleasant. So, like, instead of saying that someone was fired, like I mentioned, you could say maybe that someone was downsized or experiencing a workforce reduction. These are really the first thing that comes to my mind because they're one of the more frustrating types of euphemisms that I see. And while euphemisms can sort of try to work to soften the emotional blow of bad news, it's also something that can create confusion or just mask the truth. And that makes it like sort of these serious issues feel less urgent in some cases. So we think of the military describing civilian deaths as collateral damage. When you say collateral damage, it numbs the reality of the situation a bit, doesn't it? So then there's jargon. Jargon is specialized language tied to profession or industry, and it serves a purpose. It helps experts be able to communicate effectively. And the problem is when it leaks into everyday conversations. So this kind of jargon can create a barrier. So if you imagine a real estate agent that's describing a house as being in a challenging urban environment, what they really mean by that is that it's a bad neighborhood. And so misusing or overusing jargon can alienate people who are outside of the field, and then that obscures the meaning altogether. So when communicating to a general audience, I think that clarity is key. And this is seen a lot in healthcare, where the healthcare communication between the provider and the patient can go over the patient's head where they don't understand because the words that they're used are not on their level. The Other important one to talk about is inflated language. This type of doublespeak is all about making the ordinary seem extraordinary. So, like, for example, a used car becomes pre-owned, or fast food employee is called a culinary service provider. I mean, sure, it might sound more glamorous, but it can feel misleading or even disingenuous, right? So inflated language tries to elevate status, but also it can risk credibility in the process. So, like, why does that matter? Well, double speak draws a fine line between creativity and manipulation, and it can finesse a message. We can also be distorting the message and making it harder to communicate. So, the takeaway here, like other cases, we have to remember that our words have power and it's important to use them wisely, because that if we're not clear and honest in our communication, that is something that will be remembered by. And I know that especially in job situations, it's really true that you might be fired by someone that 10 years from now, they're in a position to be interviewed by you for a job. So to go along with this, multiple meanings in your messages, I want to get into the whole slide for you to see. There we are. When we communicate, there's always more than meets the eye, or, well, in this case, the ear, because we're talking about what we hear. And what's spoken isn't always the full story. And understanding a message deeply is something that requires us to look beyond just the words. And that's where concepts of the manifest and latent content come into play here. You can see those listed on your slide. And manifest content refers to the surface level of communication. It's the facts, the plain message, the literal meaning of the words being said. So, for example, if someone tells you, I had a long day, then that manifest content is clear. They're telling you that they were busy or they were occupied, like for that busy kind of thing. So that's manifest content. Then there's latent content. This is where things get more nuanced. Latent content is about what's underlying the message. So it's like the feelings, the attitudes, the values, the motives that are subtly conveyed beneath the surface. So, using the same example, when someone says, I had a long day, what they might really mean is, I feel drained and I'm upset. Or they might say, you might say that they're just asking for, give me support. Can you please, emotionally support me right now? So these are things that help us think about, is this just the facts, or are there more thoughts to this? And when we know people who are challenged at being able to pick up nonverbal cues or nonverbal emotions, some of this is what we're talking about, is that we have to know there is a difference between the manifest and the latent content. So to illustrate, imagine a coworker emails you and says, hey, I guess it's fine if we change this project deadline. So the manifest content there is agreement. They're saying it's okay to shift the deadline. But the latent content, sort of hinted at by that wording, and maybe like something that might indicate frustration or disapproval there, right? So if you only pay attention to the literal words, you'll miss what is truly being communicated. So, why is that distinction important? Well, it's because Every message has both a surface structure, right, which is this manifest content, and also has this deeper structure, which is what we're calling the latent content. And if you focus only on the surface and ignore the symbolic, emotional layer, then you risk missing the vital information about what's going on. Like, what are they trying to send to you? And we want to be able to get across our true attitudes, feelings, or needs. And this can lead to misunderstandings if you're not able to get the message from point A to point B the way that it was intended. And if we don't do that, then we end up with missed opportunities or missed connections or missed action or misunderstandings. And so we think back to that transactional model of communication that we talked about early on. The goal is trying to get a message that you have intended for them to receive in a certain way. So these distinctions are important. Effective communication here isn't just about hearing or reading words. It's about listening between the lines and picking up on what's implied. So we have got to be able to pay attention to their tone, their body language, and their context in these situations, because we look at someone and we say, is this person relaxed or tense? Is their tone warm? I mean, you think about a police officer walking into a convenience store that's being robbed and they don't know it. And what kind of nonverbal expression might the person who's behind the counter give, even though they might push out a manifest content that that says everything's good, hello officer today. The latent content might be, help me, I'm at risk here. So understanding messages requires us to look at both of these layers. And so recognizing the difference between manifest and latent content makes sure that you're better equipped to interpret messages accurately and build stronger emotions with people in a way that has resilience and communicate effectively. For hidden agendas, have you ever felt like someone wasn't just being fully honest with you? Like, not necessarily lying, but holding something back? Well, that's often what we call a hidden agenda. So a hidden agenda is when someone intentionally withholds information or withholds their feelings or withholds their motives, intentions, their in a way so that they can influence or manipulate somebody else and their behavior or emotions or feelings about something. So it's not always sinister. Sometimes people use hidden agendas to avoid conflict or to create a sense of hope, but they can also be used as a form of control. And when you're in that form of control, that creates a dynamic where one person holds back and the other person is left in the dark. So you might hear this described as playing games or head games, right? So, for example, if someone that you work with seems like they're overly agreeable when some kind of new process is introduced or started, then you find out later they're the person that raises all the objections in private. Then they might be somebody that you can imagine is operating with a hidden agenda, because they came out there acting like everything was cool, and then as soon as they walked out, they had a lot of negative things to say. So their outward actions aim to sort of please or avoid criticism, but underneath there's resistance here and dissatisfaction. So this is stuff they're not openly expressing. And hidden agendas can show up in relationships as well. Imagine a scenario where one partner continuously avoids discussions about important topics like finances or future plans. On the surface, it might seem like they're just sort of avoiding stress, but on a deeper level, they could be experiencing uncertainty or hesitation about commitment, or maybe they just don't, you're not ready to talk about it. And so at times, hidden agendas can be used in a positive way. Like, for instance, a leader might withhold negative information about challenges that a team is facing, right? That way they can keep morale up and maximize uh, um, the optimism around. But even in these cases, the lack of transparency can create unintended consequences because folks are going to find out eventually. And so the key message here is that hidden agendas are complex and, not always malicious, but their impact on communication is a big deal. And they can sometimes create a barrier to trust, and that can prevent a genuine connection with people. So, spotting and addressing these hidden motives is important because it allows you to um, open up your relationship with the other person, so that you can talk to them about these kinds of things, and the kinds of words that you use when you talk together. So the next slide talks about the effects of these hidden agendas on relationships. Awesome. Hidden agendas don't just affect individual conversations, they have a way of shaping entire relationships. So, at their core, hidden agendas are part of the latent content in communication. They're not in the words being said, but in what's left unsaid. So, the feelings or the fears or the motives that are simmering under the surface, and while they may remain unspoken, their impact here is often loud and clear. So, hidden agendas can create a ripple effect in relationships. So, imagine you're working with someone who continuously skirts around providing clear answers or withholding critical details. It's just over time, this evasiveness could lead to frustration because you never quite feel on the same page. And the anxiety might start creeping in as you wonder, why do things feel off? And eventually, self doubt might settle in. Like, am I overthinking about this? Am I doing something wrong? The erosion of trust can hurt professional partnerships, friendships, or even personal bonds. So the troubling part is that hidden agendas don't resolve themselves, because if they're left unchecked, they can keep influencing interactions. And that creates like a cycle of tension and sometimes miscommunication. Like, if unresolved issues resurface time and time again, it could be a sign of um, hidden motives that haven't been addressed ever in the first place. And it's kind of like that when you have passive aggressive behavior or mixed signals. These are often indicators of what's being expressed openly isn't the whole truth. But there are always ways to manage these kinds of things effectively. And the first step is identifying when there is one that exists. So you kind of have to ask yourself, are there inconsistencies in what's being said and how it's being said? And then you ask yourself something like, um, why does this feel off? How does this conversation feel stuck? How does this feel evasive? These are just red flags that can signal deeper motives at play. And sometimes people say that they have intuition, but really, that intuition is a collection of identifying these things, but maybe not being able to expressly point them out. And these are um, something that once a hidden agenda has been discovered, you just have to take the initiative to bring it to light gently, because this isn't about blame or making the other person feel defensive. It's about creating a place for honesty. If that's what you're trying to do. So, for example, you could say something like, I sense that there might be some unspoken feelings here. Can we talk about how we're going to approach this together? You know, this is something that works to try to open the door for a candid conversation, right? And you want to do it in a way that you're trying not to put the other person on the spot. But if you can identify early on, right when they say something that's not clear, that's really a time that can help figure these things out, right? The other thing is we want to foster a habit of discussing the way you work and interact. So that means that you just set clear expectations for communication, and that also can help prevent these agendas from even forming in the first place. So the ultimate goal here is that you would end up just increasing transparency in your interactions in a genuine way. And the more information that's shared openly, it's just less room for any kind of hidden motives to take root. And if you think about all the kinds of situations that you might be in with a team environment or in a relationship environment, you are with folks that you're sharing the same goals with, but are you really, right? So these are things that we want to be able to be ready to address. The signs of hidden agendas. Sometimes communication just doesn't feel right. You can't quite put a finger on it, but something feels off. And the words don't match the tone, or the actions don't match the statements. These are often signs of hidden agendas that are at play here. And so knowing how to spot them, like we said, is the first step to addressing them. So one common indicator for um, finding a hidden agenda is evasiveness. So imagine asking a coworker if they're fully on board with a new project direction. And instead of saying yes or no, they dodge the question or they provide a vague answer. Their reluctance there to commit might suggest that they're holding back deeper thoughts or feelings there. Another clue is the use of pat responses, these prepackaged answers like, it's fine, or don't worry about it. And when you deliver that, no matter how you phrase the question, it's something that's going to indicate that person's avoiding something and they're not really ready to reveal it. So, reoccurring conflicts that have no clear cause can be another red flags. Like perhaps, let's say you've noticed arguments flare up over just little minor issues or problems that were supposed to um, be resolved already, but they keep coming back. These patterns might end up stemming from these kinds of unspoken frustrations or motives that have not been addressed openly. And if you think about like a teammate who becomes unexpectedly defensive during a planning meeting, it's something that could point to deeper frustration. Another thing, if you think about hidden agendas, we know that if you're an attorney and you're working on behalf of your client to reach a settlement or to negotiate a goal, these things can really come into play, and you may have hidden agendas that are there for a reason. Same thing for investigative powers people, and it's just we have to know that there are ways to read people and to protect yourself. And in life, there are times where we need to be paying attention to inconsistencies in how people are communicating. Because when words or behavior don't align, something might, not be going on right. And recognizing the fact that people omit critical information or have long-winded conversations that go nowhere, um, these are things that can really push this issue into the limelight for you if you know what you're looking for. It's like if someone says um, uh, phrases like, you know what I mean, or we'll figure it out later. This might come across as dismissive, but it also might just be something that used to skirt a difficult underlying truth. So there are times when hidden agendas are rampant, and I think that it's situational. And so the other scenario that I think about is being a middle manager. And if you are a middle manager and you need to be able to um, ride the company line and meet the company goals, and the way that you do that, if it's done with a hidden agenda from your team, can end up eroding this kind of trust. This can happen in relationships as well. And so that's why we come at this so strong. Next, I want to talk about the interpersonal gap. So I want to ask, have you ever walked away from a conversation and you feel like the other person just totally, completely misunderstood what you said? Well, that happens. Or maybe you interpreted someone's words one way only to find out later that they just meant something entirely different. Well, that is what we're talking about when we talk about the interpersonal gap in action. So, the interpersonal gap occurs because communication isn't just about words. Messages are filtered through each person's unique attitudes and values and beliefs. And these filters act like invincible lenses. They color how we interpret what we hear and shape how what convey what we say. The challenge is that these filters often aren't the same for the speaker and for the listener. So, what the speaker intends to say can take on new meaning by the time it reaches the receiver. So, this disconnect is something that can lead to misinterpretation and frustration and even, well, conflict. So, if you have a coworker that says, I think we should adjust our approach, on the surface, they're suggesting a change. But depending on your filters and how you feel about them or the project, you might interpret what they're saying as a polite criticism. Or if they're saying, I think we should adjust our approach, then that could be indifference, or it could be a lack of confidence in the work that you've done. So if they intend to share a collaborative idea, but you walked away feeling criticized, then that whole interpersonal gap is something that just occurred. So the good news is that this is a gap that can be addressed with intentional effort. So the key here is to step back and just evaluate, take steps to ensure that the message is understood. And when you can make sure that the message is understood as it's intended, then um, you go far with your communication. And this is something that you can usually handle by putting yourself out there in a genuine way. So first, we ask questions. Never assume that you fully understand someone's words right away. So questions are powerful tools, and this is what we have to clarify intentions. So for instance, you could ask, when you say adjust our approach, do you mean a complete redesign or just some tweaks? Right. So when you ask questions like that, it helps you figure out like what are they figuring out, or what is there to figure out here about what they're saying. The second thing is that you can summarize or paraphrase like repeating back what you heard in your own words. That helps confirm understanding. So you might say, what I'm hearing is that you'd like to consider some alternatives for our strategy. Is that right? Right. So if you have something to say back, all you're doing is finding another way to clarify here. And the third thing you can do is check perceptions. Your interpretation of the message might feel accurate, but it's worth checking in. So, for example, say, I'm interpreting your feedback as a suggestion to collaborate. Is that what you're thinking? You know, Preventing the interpersonal gap is about creating dialogue, not just speaking and listening passively. It's about showing curiosity and care in your interactions. And so when both the speaker and the listener actively work to bridge some of these kind of communication gaps, that's what reinforces trust. And it eliminates a lot of unnecessary misunderstandings. So at the end of the day, clear communication isn't just about what's said, it's about making sure that what is said is something that is understood. All right, so next I want to talk about communication networks. And let's see what we have for you. Communication is not just words, it's about patterns. So these patterns or communication networks shape how people connect, interact, and share information. So think of a communication network as a blueprint, right, for social exchanges that happen in a group. These blueprints are defined by certain rules, both formal and informal, that influence who has access to information and who can communicate directly with who. Now, well, also how much participation is possible in any given interaction. So, for instance, in a work environment, formal rules might dictate that only managers report directly to the CEO. But then there are informal rules that determine how sort of approachable the supervisor is to their team. And so these networks create a flow, or in some cases, a blockade of information between individuals or groups. And they also determine the extent to which one way or two-way communication can even take place. And here's an interesting point to consider. Those who control the flow of information within the network tend to feel the most satisfied with the communication. So, why is that? It's because they feel informed and empowered, but that satisfaction isn't always shared by others. So, for example, employers further down the chain, these employees that are further down the chain, um, when they get the communication, they might experience frustration or they might feel alienated, right? Because if they sense that the information was withheld or overly managed, then they can have that frustration. So, understanding these dynamics is important to helping create a more effective communication network. And if we recognize who controls information and why satisfaction levels differ across that network, then it helps us be able to analyze and challenge harmful patterns and make sure that accessibility can be granted. I know that it's funny to say, but when smoking cigarettes was more common, I know of people in business situations who would sometimes um, smoke cigarettes, not because they necessarily wanted to smoke cigarettes, but because they wanted to do better in their career. They wanted to be able to connect with those people that were in the smoking circle, and that gave them access to that network. But I'm not saying smoke. I'm just saying that was a way in that I've seen people use. Not very healthy way. Okay, I'm getting our next slide because these communication networks don't just impact who talks to who, they shape how accessible people are to one another and how involved they can be in their conversation. These patterns of accessibility determine not just the flow of information, but also the dynamics of the participation within the group. So you might imagine a workplace where access to the decision makers is limited only to a handful of senior employees. And over time, this is going to make others feel disconnected or even neglected. And then these barriers might result in frustration as individuals begin to feel like their input isn't valued anymore, or their concerns aren't being heard. So it's important to realize that the design of a communication network is something that directly regulates how much participation is possible. If you have a hierarchical type network, for example, it might be set up so that um, all of the decision making authority is at the top, and that decreases overall participation among the team members. But on the other hand, a more open and a community and open and inclusive kind of communication network is going to do something to foster more two-way dialogues, and that's something that's going to enable everyone to have a voice. And so, one example I can think about this is being on the job in a business that is small, and then over time it grows and grows. And so, if you are a worker employee and you're used to interacting with the owner, well, the owner might not be around anymore because they start to put levels of management in place or supervisors in place. So, at its heart, this is an issue that boils down to accessibility. If you make people accessible, then participation is naturally going to rise. But when communication networks, it might be unintentional or intentional, but when communication networks limit who can connect with who, the result is often dissatisfaction and maybe even a breakdown in being able to be collaborative. So, if we design networks that prioritize accessibility and allow for things like information flow that's more seamless, that's something that's going to create an environment where everyone feels involved and valued. And one way to tackle this is by frequently reviewing the structure of the formal and the informal communication channels, and think or look at the how things are. Are there barriers that prevent some people or certain individuals or groups from participating or connecting? It might be because of a physical space of them being on a different floor or in a different building or on a different time zone, or maybe they don't have the same background, so they're not able to speak the same language. Or when I say language, I don't mean um, actual language. I just mean like jargon, right? Like being able to, I'm coming at it from this perspective and I'm coming at it from this other perspective. And so these are things that can happen a lot in business, especially when you have um, folks who are specialists in their field. And so when we look for these kinds of questions to help us figure out the structure and what's happening, then it helps us be able to understand these patterns. So I have more on communication networks here. Let me see. These communication networks don't just dictate who talks to who, they also shape how these conversations unfold. And one key aspect to consider is whether the network supports one way or two-way communication. And the difference between the two can have a huge impact on the meaning of a message, right? Like one-way communication is what we often experience in lecture style settings. And this is where information flows in a single direction from the speaker to the audience. So we think of it as like a monologue where um, it's just efficient for delivering straightforward information, but at the same time, it leaves no space for input or clarification or collaboration. And this can lead to misunderstandings since there's no opportunity to check the message to see if it was received as it was intended. And on the other hand, two-way communication is something that helps support like a dialogue of more mutual understanding. It's not just about taking turns speaking, it's about genuinely listening and then responding. Like imagine a brainstorming session where a team member shares ideas, and they ask questions and build on one another's input. It's this level of engagement that allows us to have richer and more accurate exchanges of information. And that's what ensures that everyone is on the same page. But gosh, when communication networks limit opportunities for two-way conversations, then distortions can occur. And for example, when information is passed through a long chain with no chance for feedback, the message might get misinterpreted or it might lose critical details. Think about a game of telephone, right? Each time the message is relayed, a piece of meaning here might be dropped or altered, and all that leads to a communication problem. Constraints on information flow add another layer of complexity. And so when individuals lack access to certain information or people, they often rely on speculation or incomplete fragments to sort of fill in the gaps. And this doesn't just distort the original intent of the message, but it also can create frustration and mistrust. So when I was working for a larger company in the past, there was a policy where they did not post employees' phone numbers. So you couldn't figure out the people that you worked with or their phone numbers unless you went up to them directly and said, hey, tell me your phone number. And what that did was it created a lot of problems because management then had to be fully responsible for scheduling. If you have to be fully responsible for scheduling, you can't tell the employees to find someone to cover your shift. You can't do that because you don't even know anybody's phone numbers. And so businesses do this because they're manipulating the environment. They don't want to have employees gossiping. They don't want them sharing notes or uh, talking about who's making what money or who's doing what work. And so these kinds of things you can see are set up by the employer to limit a network, but the end result is that we end up without the ability to communicate in that business. The other types of distortion networks can produce involve sharpening, leveling, and assimilation. And the first type of distortion is sharpening. And this is what's happening when certain details of a message, especially those that are emotionally charged or stand out, get retained, and then everything else fades into the background. So, for example, if you imagine like you're hearing about an upcoming company restructure, the initial message might include details like when the change might happen, the teams that are involved, and the possible benefits. But sharpening in this case might result in people only focusing on the emotionally loaded news of the potential layoffs because they can't pay attention to the broader context. That's what we talk about when we refer to the type of distortion that's sharpening distortion. Next, we have leveling. This is all about shortening the message. When information is passed along, people tend to trim it down to make it easier to understand or remember. At the same time, this often results in leaving out critical details, and that can cause misinterpretation. So, for instance, a team might summarize a strategy update in like a one sentence statement from the CEO, but the simplified version might align more with their own perspective. And that leaves the team with a skewed understanding. So, in that way, you can see that simpling things can make things a message shorter that ends up causing a misunderstanding. And then there's also assimilation. Assimilation is something that occurs when the details that remain after sharpening and leveling are sort of reshaped into a streamlined, coherent story. It's human nature to try to make sense of fragmented information, but the result can sometimes be inaccurate or biased. And so, for example, if different people pass along bits and pieces of a story about a project delay, then the final version might weave together those fragments in a way that just blames a department that doesn't need to be blamed, or ignores external factors that weren't even considered. So these distortions affect both the accuracy and the tone of messages right as they move through networks. Sharpening can amplify fear or excitement, leveling can lead to oversimplification, and assimilation can create entirely new narratives. So it's crucial to be mindful of these kinds of tendencies in organizations and in friend groups, so that you can take steps to minimize their effects. I want to talk about some more factors. Factors like distractions, memory constraints, and stress can all play a role in how messages are misunderstood or altered. So, recognizing these challenges is the first step towards improving the way we communicate here. And one key factor is listening, or rather, not fully listening. It's common to think ahead about what you want to say next instead of focusing on what the speaker's talking about right at that moment. This habit often leads to picking up on only fragments of a message, and sometimes can create only a partial or a skewed understanding of something. So, like if you're in a meeting, you might tune out something because you're thinking about how to respond to a question that's being asked, or you might miss an important update about next steps because your mind is taken over about some other topic. So, listening or not fully listening sure is one key factor. Memory is another limitation. We just can't retain all of the details that we hear. And it's especially true during complicated, complex conversations. So think about a time when someone shared a list of instructions with you verbally. And if you didn't take notes or ask for a clarification, chances are that you remember only a fraction of it afterwards. And so it isn't about carelessness, it's just human nature. And so that memory limitation is a real factor. And then there's tunnel vision. And tunnel vision is a phenomenon that often kicks in when you're under pressure, when you're overwhelmed with tasks and juggling deadlines or dealing with stress. It becomes almost impossible to process every aspect of a message. So instead, your brain selectively tones out parts, and that helps to simplify what you're hearing. And this can help you cope in the moment. At the same time, it can risk excluding critical details. Fortunately, there are practical steps that we can take to minimize these distortions, and it's not just the listener's responsibility. Clear communication is a shared effort between the sender and the receiver. Both have a role to play in ensuring that the message is understood. And so, as we've been able to go through the different aspects of communication that are so very important, I want to thank you for sticking with me through this time. And I want to encourage you to read through your chapter for this section, review the slideshow that is posted so that you're ready to participate in the discussion board this week. I look forward to that. And I look forward to our next class time. Thanks.